Deborah heard recently that the bailiff is potentially unable to collect this debt. And if so, the money that she's owed will be written off by the CMS. Can the Secretary of State explain why parents can be left with so little by the CMS if it gives up on collecting the debt for parents that work so hard?
Mr Speaker, the Government is supporting a private member's bill which aims to streamline CMS enforcement processes, and the CMS will not hesitate to use robust enforcement measures where someone is consistently refusing to meet their obligation towards their children. I'm happy to look at that case and ask my honourable friend, our noble Lord, to look at it.
Catherine Smith.
Why is statutory sick pay in this country so much lower than European comparators?
I would certainly, Mr Speaker, be very happy to meet with the Honourable Lady about the issue of statutory sick pay, and of course we always keep these matters under review.
Excellent. Right, that completes questions. Right, we now come to the Home Office statement. I call the Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. With permission, I would like to make a statement on the police's use of stop and search. It is utterly devastating when someone is killed by a weapon. Passivity is not an option, nor is wishful thinking, and this will only change if we act. The police have been crystal clear with me that stop and search is a vital tool, literally vital. We cannot hope to get weapons off our streets without it. Of course, it must be used skillfully, responsibly, and proportionately, as is true of every power with which we invest the police. But it would be a tragic mistake to conclude that stop and search is too controversial to use extensively, or that it cannot be used effectively with sensible safeguards. Suggestions that it is a means of victimising young black men have it precisely the wrong way round, Mr Speaker. The facts are that young black men are disproportionately more likely to be victims of violent crimes. They are the ones most in need of protection. This is about saving the lives of young black men. Moreover, being stopped and searched when carrying a weapon can prevent someone of whatever background from making a terrible mistake that they can never undo. Sometimes we lose sight of this point when debating stop and search. Mr Speaker, black people account for around 3% of our population, yet almost a third of under 25s killed by knives are black. 99 young people lost their lives to knife crime in England and Wales in the year ending March 2022. 31 of them were black, 49 were white, 16 were from other ethnic minority groups, and 3 victims did not have their ethnicity recorded. It's always bad policy to place unsubstantiated theories ahead of demonstrable fact. In this case, it would be lethal. Mr Speaker, stop and search works. Sir Mark Rowley, the Met Police Commissioner, has said that there are countless examples of offenders being discovered to have dangerous weapons during stop and searches, as well as tools for burglary and drugs. Sir Mark cited research from the Oxford Journal of Policing, which showed that stop and search can cut the number of attempted murders by 50% or more in the worst crime hotspots. Since 2019, more than 40,000 weapons have been taken off our streets, and there have been over 220,000 arrests following a stop and search. We are starting to trial serious violence reduction orders, which can be given to those with convictions for knife offences. An SVRO that the police can stop and search that individual at any point to see if they are carrying a weapon. This will deter those people who repeatedly carry weapons and endanger the public. I saw for myself how well this is working in Merseyside, where there are 5 live orders already. Superintendent Phil Mullally, Merseyside's lead for serious violence and knife crime, has said these new powers will enable us to continue to drive down knife crime and reoffending. I'm proud to say that under this government, it's never been easier for the police to make legitimate use of their stop and search powers. And the use of those powers has never been more transparent and accountable. The public are crying out for common sense policing, such as the use of tried and tested methods to drive down crime. Stop and search is a prime example of such a method. I'm working in lockstep with police forces to get this right. Today, I met Chief Constable Amanda Pearson, who leads on stop and search for the National Police Chiefs Council, to discuss how best to empower police officers to better use stop and search. I've written to all Chief Constables asking them to provide strategic leadership and direction in the use of stop and search powers, ensure that every officer is confident in the effective and appropriate use of all stop and search powers, including the use of suspicionless powers, to investigate instances where someone is obstructing or interfering with the use of these powers, and if necessary, make arrests, and to be proactive in publishing body-worn video footage which will protect officers who conduct themselves properly and instill greater public confidence. Public confidence, Mr. Speaker, is the linchpin of our model of policing by consent. Therefore, I'm looking carefully at strengthening local community scrutiny. Transparency is vital. So is community engagement. And I want every community to be able to trust in stop and search. I want to present a clear picture of the stop and search landscape, which shows the good work being done on the front line. That's why the government will amend the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984, Code A, to make clear when the police should communicate when suspicionless powers are used in a public order and Section 60 context. Suspicionless stop and search must be used responsibly, but we cannot do without it. I'm also mandating data collection on stop and search as part of the annual data requirement for government statistics bulletins published every year. We already collect more data on stop and search than ever before. This data is posted online, enabling police and crime commissioners and others to hold forces to account for their use. Disparities in the use of stop and search remain, but they have continued to decrease for the last 3 years. My department has trialled a more sophisticated approach to calculating disparity in the Metropolitan Police Service. It's produced an analysis based on actual suspects of violent crime, rather than usual residents of an area, as the denominator for calculating rates of stop and search. This is still experimental, but shows that disparity ratios were significantly reduced for black people compared with the traditional method, falling from 3.7 to 1.2. Mr. Speaker, it's always heartbreaking and distressing to read reports about stabbings and shootings. I'm struck by how often mothers of murdered young black men say that stop and search could have saved their sons' lives. We owe it to them to heed their call. The facts are on their side. Stop and search works and is a vital tool in the fight against serious violent crime. And I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Knife crime destroys lives, it devastates families, it creates fear and trauma in communities. And too many young people lost their lives to knife crime last year, young people who had their whole lives ahead of them. But knife crime is up nearly 70% just compared to just 7 years ago. Knife-enabled rape and knife-enabled threats to kill are at record highs, with some of the steepest increases in the suburbs, in smaller cities, towns and in counties. Compared to over a decade ago, knife crime is up more than 5-fold in Surrey, almost trebled in Sussex. And from Milton Keynes to Swindon to Newcastle, I have spoken to distressed parents and community leaders about rising knife crime and their devastation at young lives who are being lost. But the government's response is wholly inadequate. The serious violence strategy is more than 5 years out of date. The Serious Violence Task Force was disbanded, and everyone knows from their own communities too little is being done to divert young people away from violence and crime. There are just 18 violence reduction units. And when the Home Secretary claims serious violence is going down, she's focusing on the COVID period, because the worrying truth is that knife crime and gun crime are rising again. Today's statement, therefore, is wholly inadequate as a response to knife crime. Stop and search is an extremely important tool in the fight against knife crime, but it isn't the whole strategy, and that's why we need a much more comprehensive approach, and why Labour has said we will set as part of our mission the determination to halve knife crime and serious violent crime. And because stop and search is an important tool, that's also why it needs to be used in an effective and fair way. Her Majesty's Chief Inspector said just a few weeks ago, well-targeted stop and search is a valuable tool, but how the police do it is as important as the act itself. And communities have clear concerns about the fair use of stop and search. And the Inspectorate had previously said, unfair use of powers can be counterproductive. If it leads people to think it is acceptable not to comply with the law, it may also make people unwilling to report when they are the victim of crime or come forward as witnesses. And that's why it's so important that the recommendations the Inspectorate and the police watchdog have made are taken so seriously and are implemented, and also why the best practice from forces that are doing a good job on this across the country is spread too. But there have been reports from the Inspectorate in 2015, 2017, 2021, from the police watchdog, little of which the Home Secretary has even acknowledged. She has dismissed concerns about disproportionality. Now, of course, stop and search for knife crime and for dangerous weapons will likely be used most in the areas and communities where attacks have been the highest. That will affect the number of searches for weapons among young black men. But the Chief Inspector has said the presence of disproportionality in crime victimisation rates doesn't adequately explain why there is disproportionality in stop and search rates. And the Home Secretary in her statement seems to only be focusing on young black men. I think she refers to them around 6 times, with only one reference to people who are white, even though her own statement recognises that young black men are still the minority of knife crime victims. Does she recognise the importance of following the evidence wherever it takes the police? The Inspectorate said 35 years since the introduction of stop and search, the police still cannot explain why those powers are used disproportionately. And they point out that that's partly because the majority of searches are in fact for drug possession, not for knife crime at all. And yet figures show that drug use is actually lower among black people than among white people. And she hasn't addressed that at all as part of her statement. Will she address the issue about disproportionate drug possession searches? Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the references to the introduction of stronger community scrutiny and better data collection. Those are vital, but they should have been mandatory for very many years. They've been recommended many years ago. Where is the action that has been repeatedly recommended? Training on the use of force, training on de-escalation and communication skills, proper data collection on traffic stops. None of those have been referred to in her statement. And how many of the 18 recommendations by the IOPC from last year have now been fully implemented? How many of the recommendations from the Inspectorate have now been fully implemented? Stop and search is a vital tool as part of a proper strategy, but we need the wider strategy too. So why is she only doing the VRU approach in 18 areas when knife crime is rising in communities across the country? Why has there been no new serious violence strategy for 5 years? Because many people do now fear a long, hot summer unless there is swift action. Why is there still no action to bring in a new law on the criminal exploitation of young people, something that we have called for? Why are there still not comprehensive action on youth mentors and support for early intervention? We need a serious approach to tackling knife crime and supporting the police to use their tools in an effective and fair way so that they can save lives. Too many young lives are at stake. We need more than this from the Home Secretary.
Home Secretary. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Honourable Lady for her response. It's not just my view, but it's also the view of the police that stop and search is fundamentally about saving lives and keeping the public safe. And where used proportionately, stop and search works. Since 2019, more than 40,000 weapons have been seized through stop and search, and 220,000 arrests have been made. The 2021 Inspectorate report concluded that The vast majority of stop and search decisions are based on reasonable grounds, incidentally. But that's potentially thousands of lives saved, countless violent incidents prevented. To those who claim it's a disproportionate tool, a racist tool, we must be honest about what that means for victims. When the Right Honourable Lady, when she was chairman of the Select Committee, stated that stop and search is more disproportionate now than 22 years ago, with no adequate explanation or justification for the nature and scale of racial disparities, I say that yet again, she's on the wrong side of the argument. And yet again, she's not on the side of victims. Because what is disproportionate, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that black people are 4 times more likely to be murdered than white people. What is disproportionate is that young black men are more likely to be victims of knife crime than young white men. That's the disproportionality that I'm focused on stopping. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's important that we look at the matter with a cool head and based on the evidence. The emerging picture based on London suggests that when you adjust the data to consider the proportion of suspects in an area and its demographics, rather than consider the data for the country as a whole, the disproportionality of stop and search falls away hugely. And I'd urge the Right Honourable Lady to consider and reflect on those facts rather than jump to knee-jerk assumptions. Now, of course, it's right that these powers are used in a responsible way and in a measured way, and that's why engagement with communities needs to be respectful, and it is right that the powers are subject to the highest levels of scrutiny. And we now see that there are very few complaints about individual stop and searches. We've seen that training on legal and procedural justice has improved, and we've seen confidence levels increase. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, overall and in conclusion, I'm very proud of this Conservative government's achievements. A record number of police officers ever in the history of policing. 100,000 weapons seized since 2019. Falling crime, in fact, serious violent crime falling by 40% since 2010. And instead, what have Labour done? Well, they voted against our measures to strengthen the police. They voted against tougher sentences for rapists. They voted against our bill to stop the militant protesters. Same old Labour, they never fail to miss an opportunity to be on the wrong side of the argument. This Conservative government, Madam Deputy Speaker, is on the side of common sense policing and on the side of the British people.
David Davis.
Everybody in the House will share the Home Secretary's laudable aims of cutting knife crime. But she'll remember that when we debated the new stop and search powers, I think it was the day after the Casey report came out, and I cited some examples from that report. I found examples where police officers had justified carrying out a search based on a person's ethnicity alone, had been rude or uncivil while carrying out the search, and had used excessive force, leaving people, often young people, humiliated, distressed, and this damaged trust in the Met. And Casey called for a fundamental reset of the Met's use of stop and search powers. Now, at the time, I took it that the Home Secretary agreed with the Casey report. So can she tell the House how what she's proposing today, which may have considerable merit, takes on board that reset? How has she absorbed that reset into what she's doing today?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his question. What we are, this government and indeed myself, we fully support the police in the fair use of stop and search to crack down on violent crime and to protect communities, because every knife taken off our streets is a potential life saved. That is the value that stop and search brings to fighting crime. The announcement that I'm making today brings together a series of measures whereby there will be an obligation to include more reporting and a greater increase on the data. That's something that's been commented on by previous inspectors and reports, so that we have a clearer picture of its use and its efficacy. There'll be guidance issued by the College of Policing, but already we have seen an improvement in accountability, an improvement in scrutiny, and as a result, a fall in the number of complaints.
Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, Dame Diana Johnson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, in 2021 the Home Affairs Select Committee's inquiry into how much progress had been made in tackling racism in policing since the landmark Stephen Lawrence inquiry found, as a cross-party committee, that the disproportionate use of stop and search powers against black people was even greater than it had been when Sir William's inquiry concluded 22 years earlier. No evidence provided to the committee adequately explained or justified the nature and scale of racial disproportionality in the use of stop and search powers, and this has damaged confidence in the tactic and in policing by consent. Of course, stop and search is a valid policing tactic, as the Home Secretary has said, but it must be used in a focused and fair way and underpinned by an evidence base. So can the Home Secretary please explain what evidence base she is drawing on when she says police forces need to ramp up the use of stop and search powers, and will she commit to commissioning a fully independent and comprehensive study of the efficacy of stop and search tactics, and will she also undertake an equality impact assessment on this new policy?
Well, as I mentioned in my statement, at the department we're trialling a more sophisticated approach to calculating disparity with a focus on the Metropolitan Police Service, and that has produced a very useful analysis based on actual suspects of violent crime rather than the totality of usual residents of an area as a denominator for calculating the rates of stop and search. It is experimental, but the data that is emerging from this advanced study demonstrates that disparity ratios are significantly reduced for black people compared with the traditional method, falling from 3.7 to 1.2. That is an evidence base which is emerging and upon which policy will be made.
Sir John Redwood.
I strongly support the Home Secretary's further measures to cut the unacceptable loss of life from violent crime. And will she confirm that this statement today is part of a much wider strategy to tackle the underlying causes and problems, as well as the use of the weapons?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right. Stop and search is one tool in our armoury against the fight against violent crime. We have increased police resources and broader police powers. We've continued funding for our violence reduction units, which bring together local partners to tackle the drivers of violent crime in their area. We are working with piloting the serious violence reduction orders. We've rolled out knife crime prevention orders, and we have been working intensively with all agencies to ensure that they prioritise this crime and take the appropriate action.
Diane Abbott.
The Home Secretary spoke about black mothers. I'm a black mother, and I know very many black mothers. They are my friends, they are my relatives, and they are my constituents. And I have represented an inner-city constituency for nearly 40 years. So will the Home Secretary explain to the House how her statement meets the long-standing concern of black mothers, not just about the tragedy of a life lost, but about the use of suspicionless powers? And as has been said earlier, how does the statement fit in with a Casey review?
Well, as I said, stop and search and its use is at core about saving lives and preventing crime. That's what it's about. And I have been incredibly encouraged and reassured by the evidence that's emerging from local forces. Take Manchester. Stephen Watson, the Chief Constable there, has said that a 260% increase in the use of stop and search over a defined period led to a 50% or correlated with a 50% reduction in firearms discharges, and they saw a fall in the number of complaints. So I think there is a concerted effort to improve and increase the way in which stop and search is applied. It must be applied judiciously, proportionately, legitimately, but it is a vital tool in saving lives.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Of the 220,000 arrests, how many were for repeat offences? And of those, how many resulted in a custodial sentence?
Well, my right honourable friend raises a very good point, and that is exactly why we are piloting the serious violence reduction orders, because they empower the police to place an order on an individual who already has a conviction for a knife-related offence, giving them greater powers to stop them should they breach the terms of their order. The initial reports are very positive from the way this extra power is being used by the police.
Dawn Butler.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, Maya Angelou said, when somebody shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Yeah. This Home Secretary showed us who she is time and time again. Now, stop and search has resulted in just 9% of offensive weapons and items linked to burglary. Just 9%. No other organisation would ramp up something that only yielded a result of 9%. Scotland was the knife capital of the UK. They reduced their knife crime by 69% by using a public health approach. So my question to the Home Secretary is, why is she not using a public health approach?
Well, I disagree with the characterisation that the Honourable Lady puts forward, because last year, stop and search resulted in almost 67,000 arrests and removed around 14,900 weapons and firearms from our streets. And crime statistics show that an increased use of stop and search is driving the continuing increase in police-recorded possession of bladed weapon offences, helping the police to save lives. But we obviously work with all agencies, because stopping crime needs a multi-dimensional, multi-agency approach. That's what our violence reduction units are all about. That's what our GRIP funding is all about. That's what our Safer Streets funding is all about, bringing together all of the relevant agencies to prevent crime in the first place.
Tim Lawton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I agree with the Home Secretary's support for stop and search when used as skillfully and responsibly as a tool. But when the All-Party Group for Children did some work into this a few years ago, we found an alarming number of under 10-year-olds who were being stopped and searched, and police procedures were not being properly used for younger children. What assurances can she give me that things have changed, and particularly on sensitive younger children, stop and search is only used in extremis and under controlled circumstances?
Well, there are clear legal limits around the use of stop and search, and it is only applicable for over 18s, the Section 60 power. It is absolutely vital that the police understand the use of the legal limits, and that's why I'm very glad that training in procedural justice has improved. The authorised professional practice by the College of Policing will include greater detail on the limits on how police officers should exercise their powers, and the use of body-worn video footage has been a game changer in improving the accountability and transparency on how this power is used, and that's why we're seeing a fall in the number of complaints.
Manira Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, as a London MP, my community has felt the effects of young lives tragically lost to knife crime, as well as some innocent teenagers and black and mixed-race people in my constituency telling me they feel they have a target on their backs in terms of stop and search. But when you look at the figures, with knife crime having risen 65% since 2015, at the same time as suspicionless stop and search hugely expanding, and the IOPC itself saying that suspicionless stop and search undermines confidence in the police, why is it that the Home Secretary once again insists on this policy by press release for such complex, sensitive issues, instead of focusing on the hard yards of properly resourced community policing based on intelligence gathering to prevent and solve crimes?
Well, I don't accept that, because, of course, there is nothing that any of us can say to someone who has lost a loved one to knife crime that will make it better. But tackling serious violence is an absolute priority for this government, and we are making progress. Since 2010, serious violent crime has fallen by 41%. And our approach has been twin track, combining tough law enforcement like intensive police patrols in hotspot areas of violence and ramping up the use of stop and search with a more long-term strategy to engage more young people and steer them away from a life of violence. Operation Scepter, recently rolled out through many forces, focusing on knife crime, using powers proactively, has resulted in very good results in many forces when it comes to the seizure of offensive weapons.
Nikki Aiken. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Stop and search is obviously can play a big role in keeping people safe on the streets, but it has to be part of a much wider strategy, particularly encouraging young people not to carry a knife in the first place. But would my right honourable friend consider encouraging police forces up and down the country to use knife wands, which can prove more helpful for those who are being searched and those searching, and act as less intrusive in the whole process?
Well, we've got a range of orders, and one of them is being piloted. Those are serious violence reduction orders. Let me just clarify if there's any doubt on what I say. So SVROs are for over 18s. Section 60s can be used on anyone, including under 18s. So let me just be clear about that. But SVROs are aimed at providing a targeted tool for the police. They're being piloted at the moment. So anyone who's got a conviction for a knife-related offence can be subject to a specific order which will enable and empower the police to stop them more quickly and therefore prevent crime should they breach the terms of their order.
Steve McKay.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Home Secretary said in her statement and in her answers about the benefits of body-worn camera footage. What percentage of current stop and search operations are actually filmed by officers wearing body cameras?
Well, we know that the use of body-worn video has increased dramatically throughout police forces, and it's now a significant element in the transparency and the accountability. There are several layers of scrutiny and challenge injected into the system these days, whether it's internal supervision, whether it's internal feedback, whether it's the stop and search scrutiny panels, or whether it's various other inspections. Body-worn video footage can inform the training and the accountability, and that is one reason why there are greater levels of public confidence in stop and search and a lower number of complaints.
Nick Fletcher.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Secretary of State for her statement. Suspicious of stop and search must be used responsibly. But does the Secretary of State agree with me that any members who think that this tactic is wrong should speak with officers who have had to deliver the news to a mum or a dad that their son has been stabbed?
My honourable friend puts it very well. And the police, our frontline partners who are dealing with this issue day in, day out, who indeed have to break the tragic news to parents, every parent's worst nightmare, report back that this tool, stop and search, when used lawfully, proportionately and reasonably, is a vital tool in the fight against crime and is fundamentally very effective in saving lives.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I don't know, and I hope, frankly, that my residents in Walthamstow are not listening to this, because it's just plain offensive to those of us in the heart of this challenge. Just a few weeks ago, I got up to ask the Prime Minister about a 16-year-old boy murdered in my community outside his school, another 16-year-old in court charged with it. This weekend, last night, I was sat with residents having an emergency residents meeting because we'd had a serious shooting in my community, another young man critical but stable in hospital. None of my residents would dispute the role that stop and search can play, but we're all arguing, begging, pleading this government to recognise the epidemic of youth violence in our country And I simply say to the Home Secretary, she says she cares about these young people, then invest in their future. Yeah. Under her government, the investment in youth services has plummeted from £158 per head to just £37. I asked the Prime Minister to make this one of his national priorities. He ignored the question. Will she do something different and put her budget into correcting that deficit?
I'm very proud of what this government has achieved when it comes to law and order. We've got falling crime. We've got a record number of police officers ever in the history of policing. We've put over £100 million this financial year alone into tackling serious violence. And since 2019, 136,000 violent offences have been prevented in places operating government initiatives. That's thousands of lives saved, thousands of violent incidents prevented. I only wish she'd welcome that.
Scott Benton.
Frontline police officers by reducing the amount of bureaucracy and paperwork which takes up more and more of their time. Officers often say to me that this increases year on year and so reduces the amount of time they can spend on the beat. What steps is the government taking to cut out the paperwork and free up frontline time to be keeping our communities safe?
My honourable friend raises a very good point, and one of the big programmes of work that I'm leading at the Home Office relates to freeing up police time, reducing bureaucracy so that police officers are unencumbered to fight crime and respond to the public's priorities. That's why we have announced changes to the way the police officers will interact with health partners when it comes to mental health incidents. We are reforming the Home Office counting rules, which will save thousands of hours in avoiding duplicative or unnecessary recording of crime. And we've got a programme of reform to help empower the police so that they can better respond to the priorities that the British people have.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister talked about common sense policing, but I have to ask what sense she applied when making a statement about suspicion of stop and search, whilst making no reference to the well-evidenced racist, discriminatory use of it. Does she not think we should be focusing on solutions that would actually make communities like mine safer, like reversing education cuts, ending school exclusions, improving mental health services, taking people out of poverty? And if the Minister has already said that the police have the powers necessary, why is she arguing that they have greater powers for this particular practice, which actually leads to less confidence in policing?
I don't consider the use of stop and search when done lawfully to be racist. What I do consider to be disproportionate and unjustifiable is that black people are 4 times more likely to be murdered than white people, that young black men are more likely to be victims of crime than young white men. That's the disproportionality, that's the disparity that I'm working to stop.
Is Savile Roberts?
Last year, a response to an FOI request revealed that the gap in the stop and search rates between white people and black people was greater in Wales than in England. We don't know the latest rates, however, as the Home Office doesn't provide regular Wales-specific data on stop and search rates by population. Before the Home Secretary pushes for further use of stop and search in Wales, will she commit to regularly publishing Wales-specific data so we can properly understand the effect of this policy on our communities?
Well, my announcement today is all about increasing the levels of data that are reported by police forces so that we can have a clearer picture of exactly how these important powers are being used.
Timothy Singh Desai.
Thank you very much. Madam Deputy Speaker, across our country, including in my Slough constituency, knife crime is up by 70% compared to 7 years ago. But shockingly, there is only a 1% success rate in terms of the policies by the Home Secretary. She's today asking the police to ramp up the use of stop and search. But as I said, in terms of conviction rates, there is only a 1% success rate. All that, meanwhile, we've had funding to youth centres slashed, decimated over the last decade. So is the Home Secretary embarrassed by the failures of Conservative government policies? over the last 13 years? And can she also explain why black people are despairingly 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched than everybody else?
Well, I listen to frontline police officers and I look at the data when I make policy. And the police tell us that stop and search is a vital tool to crack down on criminals and to protect communities. Sir Mark Rowley, earlier this year, said that he had countless examples of offenders being discovered to have dangerous weapons, tools for burglary or drugs on their person that have been uncovered by his officers being in the right place at the right time and using this important power. These are examples, this is evidence of the utility of stop and search.
Florence Ashalomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, the framing of knife crime as a black issue is frankly lazy and a dangerous narrative. We need to work with all our communities to understand the core issues around the root cause of crime and why some of our young people feel they need to carry a knife. Some of them are victims. And I want all constituents in my Vauxhall constituency to feel safe and go about their daily business. But the reality is that stop and search on its own is a blunt tool. The Independent Office for Police Conduct found that a single black boy was searched 60 times, 6-0, between the ages of 14 and 16, leaving him fearful of the police. Madam Deputy Speaker, no one in this House will think that's an effective use of the police time. So can the Home Secretary outline what measures she's doing to end what the IOPC found as disproportionate impact of stop and search on black, Asian and minority ethnic people?
Well, as I've said, it's absolutely vital that stop and search is used judiciously, carefully, reasonably and proportionately, and that there is effective community engagement and scrutiny. And there are today more layers of scrutiny and challenge than ever before on the use of this particular power. Internal supervision first and foremost, internal feedback on each stop and search depending on the force. Stop and search scrutiny panels, either chaired by a member of the community or by police and crime commissioners. Inspectorate observations and internal force professional standards investigations when there is a complaint. That's why we're seeing higher levels of confidence and lower levels of complaints.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Will the Home Secretary commit to an independent evaluation on her proposals, with particular emphasis on the impact on confidence in marginalised minority communities in policing, and obviously in the impact on community relations?
Well, what I hear from Chief Constables is that there has been a much increased and much needed awareness of the impact on different communities, and therefore in many forces there's been an improvement in the way outreach has been conducted, much more respect with communities, to communities who may be affected by the use of these particular powers. And the 2021 Inspectorate report noted that there'd been an improvement in engagement and training on the part of forces. I think we should welcome that.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Institutional racism is a fact. It's also a fact that stop and search is not used proportionately or sensibly. Liberty has said that stop and search powers are ineffective and discriminatory, disproportionately impacting on black communities, and that these powers will worsen existing divisions between police and communities at a time when public trust and confidence in the police is at a serious low. So can the Home Secretary confirm what evidence that she has that ramped up stop and search will tackle serious violent crime?
Well, in her Inspectorate report of 2021, Wendy Williams confirmed that the majority of stop and search decisions were based on reasonable grounds. That's the legal test. She said that most forces have good external scrutiny arrangements. She said that forces are better at monitoring the use of stop and search compared to previous years, and she said that training has improved. That's the evidence that I find encouraging.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Policing by consent depends on trust and confidence in the police. Officers are increasingly stopping law-abiding young people under the spurious claim that they smell cannabis when none has been smoked or is present. And then the police are refusing to provide the necessary receipts and documents to those they've stopped. This failure to follow guidelines is shattering the trust that young people have in the police. What's she doing to address this?
Well, I fundamentally disagree with the Honourable Lady's proposition. Stop and search can be used if there is, in the case of drugs, and it is largely used in those instances. It is a vital tool in the fight against drugs possession and drug supply, and it can prevent young people from falling into the spiral of drugs.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Why on earth does the Home Secretary think it's a good idea, in a free and democratic country, to encourage more Section 60 searches, known as suspicionless powers, which allow an individual to be stopped without cause and without need and without reasonable suspicion, instead of adopting a targeted, intelligence-led approach? Is this because of a lack of intelligence in the Home Office?
Simply put, because they prevent crime and save lives.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the Secretary of State's statement? The use of stop and search is an issue which has been raised with me during an ongoing feud in my constituency of Strangford, and yet the PSNI have used this as an effective tool to combat the transport and sale of illegal drugs, taking lethal weapons off the streets and to find evidence for criminal activity. Will or can the Secretary of State advise if her advice to police forces on the mainland will extend to our forces in Northern Ireland, who live under a high threat level and need the legal ability for stop and search to be fully understood and endorsed? And if not, will the Right Honourable Lady ask her colleague, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, to make this messaging crystal clear in Northern Ireland as well? Thank you.
Well, as my honourable gentleman will know, I can't speak for PSNI, but since the County Lines programme was launched in England and Wales in 2019, police activity has resulted in over 3,500 lines closed, 10,000 arrests and 5,700 safeguarding referrals, all linked to drugs offences. That's a success story, and we must keep going.
That completes the statement.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to my question on the two-child benefit cap last week, the Prime Minister responded claiming that his government had lifted 400,000 children out of absolute poverty since 2010. Something which, on the face of it, seems like an achievement worth celebrating. However, as the Prime Minister well knows, this statistic does not support his claim. Absolute poverty does not take into account the impact of inflation, which is why economists and organisations as the Institute of Fiscal Studies use relative poverty as a much more accurate measure of the reality.
Yeah, that's great. Obviously, you gave me to, you need a reply, but you can't make a speech. I've got it. OK. Can I first of all say I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for giving notice of a point of order. I have not had any notice of such a statement being made. She will know that ministerial responses are a matter for ministers, not the Chair. If the Prime Minister accepts a mistake has been made, it is open to him to correct the record. In any event, the Honourable Member has certainly put it into perspective on the matter to the House. So I will now move on. Another point of order, David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to seek your guidance on two issues of potential contempt. Last Friday, the Daily Telegraph published the headline, "Johnson Allies vow to oust MPs who vote for his censure." In accordance with sections 1514 and 1516 of Erskine May, these attempts to influence members voting on a quasi-judicial finding of this House seem to me to be a prima facie issue of contempt. So may I seek your guidance on whether I'm correct on this point, and perhaps even more importantly, whether any attempt to carry out such a threat to deselect a member based on their votes in today's debate would in itself be a contempt of this House.
Can I first of all say I thank the Honourable Gentleman for notice of his point of order. The proper course for raising a matter of privilege is to write to me privately, but I note the committee has indicated it will report further on the pressures placed on its members. As I have said before the House referred this matter to the committee and members, they should always respect that. Right. Let us come now to a presentation of Bill. Secretary Gove.
Economic Activity of Public Bodies Overseas Matters Bill. Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Okay. Tomorrow is the answer. I now call for the Leader of the House to move the motion. Leader of the House, Benny Morton.
I beg to move the motion in my name. Mr. Speaker, in accordance with convention, as Leader of the House, I have brought forward this motion at the earliest opportunity to allow members to take a decision on the committee's recommendation. It is for members of this House to, in accordance with the principle of exclusive cognizance, investigate matters of privilege in this place, and the findings being debated here are those of the Privileges Committee. The government respects these important constitutional principles, and that is why we have facilitated